Okay, great. So welcome back to the San Francisco Psychedelic Society. Thank you for viewing episode 2 of Shamans of the Global Village, The Road to Wirikuta with José Luis Ramírez and the Peyote Cactus. As we find ourselves in unprecedented times and a world which is much more fragile than ever currently, we need to listen to the elders, to the planet, and to the medicines that she secretes to bring us back into the right relationship. Let's re-enchant ourselves with the song of the world and the power of shamanism in these transformative times. We are honored to have the opportunity to speak with the filmmakers of this documentary, and I want to welcome Razam and Niles Heckman to the screen. So a little bit about director Niles Heckman. Not only is he really an amazing person, but Niles Heckman documents his life as a street photographer, host of the podcast An Infinite Path, and is a documentary filmmaker through his production entity, Aurora Lab. He is the director of the 2018 feature film Transmutation and the documentary series Shamans of the Global Village, which began in 2016 and is ongoing. And a warm welcome to Razam. Rak is a true pioneer in the psychedelic space and a leading experimental journalist writing about and helping shape the emergence of a new cultural paradigm in the 21st century. Not only is Rak just truly such a gentle, sweet, compassionate soul, he's also the author of the critically acclaimed book, Aya Awakenings, a Shamanic Odyssey, and the companion volume of interviews, the Ayahuasca Sessions, and he is a frequent lecturer on ayahuasca and the shamanic revival sweeping the rest, and is the writer and the host of the documentary series Shamans of the Global Village. So welcome both Rak and Niles Heckman. And I want to also mention Juan José Ramírez Garcia, who is not able to be present with us today, but he is the key figure in the film. Juan José Ramírez Garcia is a man of knowledge via his cultural roots and experiences. He has participated in projects at an international level for the defense of the territories related to his culture. He is a musician, a doctor, peasant of labor, while having a name which symbolizes the sacred candle and the Wirikuta language. He has formulated a curriculum of devotion to his habits and customs that evidences the search for universality of being. So welcome Niles and Rak to the screen.
Thanks, Danielle. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, great. Thanks for having us. You know, this was, it's nice to do it under this structure. I know this is a little bit kind of unprecedented times and we find ourselves somewhat like uploading to the Deus Ex Machina through screens and not necessarily the best way. This term social distancing is so rubbish because we're such social beings. So it should be called temporary physical separation or something until we all unite again in person.
I agree with you.
Yeah.
And it feels like we're united more than ever with this global community here.
Yeah, yeah.
I think it's a great opportunity.
Go ahead, yeah. I didn't hear you for a second.
Yeah, it's a great opportunity. I mean, this has been really wonderful. I think it's my first watch party I've actively participated in. But what a great format for us all to be able to come together from across the world and to synchronize at this one point in time and to share this content. Like, you know, the conceit of the show, the thematic sort of focus is not just shamanism, it's the global village. And it's how do we connect from the wisdom of the earth through the caretakers of the medicine people that are in indigenous communities to the students and the seekers who are interested in shamanism and the earth medicines, and then further out into these virtual networks to spread the message and to help people understand that these pathways exist and that these relationships exist within them and within the connection to the earth. So thank you to the Psychedelic Society of San Francisco and to Danielle and to all the crew who have helped put on this event so far. It feels like a great success.
Absolutely, and thanks for collaborating and partnering with us. So I'd love to start this off with, I'm curious, why a series? Tell us about the series.
Yeah, just to hint on that real quick, I mean, this is a very uniquely done series, right? Because most shows one might watch while uploading to, Amazon Prime or like Netflix, or these things that have big budgets and are made in one chunk of an entire season and are, banged out in some set of time with numerous, hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not $1 million budgets. But this is just kind of Rack and I's hobby as being hobby filmmakers. So as the first episode came about a bit through just alignments in our lives together in 2016, we just made this pilot episode for this series. And I will credit Rack as being a very creative person. And as somebody that has a podcast that talks a lot about creativity, I will give Rack an amazing credit for many of his internal experiences. You see a lot outwardly manifesting, since the inside is the cause and the outside is the effect. So this series was one of his many, many, mind dumps, probably from some other place of like, let's do a series on, being representatives or not being spokesperson for Indigenous people, but let's use our two skill sets to make something that can help share these insights. So we put together the pilot episode in 2016, and this series is just kind of made when we can scrounge the resources together to do another episode. So here we are about 4 years later, having actualized episode 2, because each one of these things is a monumental undertaking. To make a documentary film is a massive, massive amount of work. It's like climbing Mount Everest every time. And so this is something that's kind of a slow drip series. We had a long time between episodes. Hopefully that time frame will continue to get shorter as we keep doing episodes, is the plan. But it's been a beautiful synergy of both of our skill sets, and also we find ourselves like weaving our own spiritual path through the pilgrimages of making these episodes.
And did you encounter any? I'm sorry, go ahead.
I'd like to say that, essentially, the path never ends, right? So where do you draw the line? But, I first, to try to condense it down, I first transited into the shamanic world from the more countercultural psychonautical world, I'd say in 2006, when I first went down to the Amazon and was discovering and writing about ayahuasca and the lineage of the indigenous Peruvian traditions. But then, basically as that journalism turned into a book and then later a film with Ira Awakenings, I realized that there was this whole intergenerational movement. And, a lot of the labels and a lot of the catchphrases that even I use and we all use in these communities, like old world, new world, indigenous, Westerners, they're handy labels to separate us, but ultimately we're all one people. But what I recognized was that there was a large Western, what I call the global shamanic resurgence happening. And now you see a parallel movement with the global psychedelic renaissance, which is more the medicalization of existing laboratory catalyst drugs, but the shamanic resurgence, which had been nurtured by indigenous people and kept alive, these traditions of shamanism and earth medicines, and this hunger from a new generation, which is 2 generations old now, that was spreading, and that, people were wanting not just to work with indigenous cultures and respect them and learn from the inside about these experiences, opening up their paradigm and their connection with themselves and the earth. But there was this seedbed happening where many Westerners were taking on board the great responsibility of being practitioners or healers or neo-shamans, as we might split the definition, or, working with it. But there was basically a global village, and there was this interesting demographic explosion of shamanism that I was like, shamans of the global village. So it was always percolating. It's a phrase that's in the Ira Awakenings book. And basically, when I first met Niles in 2014 and 15, and we started to talk about working on the series, it really seemed like a great brand and a great term which united the 2 worlds, the global village of Marshall McLuhan with the indigenous and ancient world of shamanic earth medicines. So here we are.
I'm grateful to be here. Did you encounter any challenges while doing these first 2 episodes?
Yes, monumental. It's kind of like we laugh at that. I mean, again, getting anything done is stratospherically difficult. I mean, there's so many people that try and start something, and finishing is the hardest part, right? So getting anything that's crap done is hard enough, let alone something that's halfway decent, let alone something that's really good for a very small budget. So this is a series that, of course, is a passion project, And it's something that we want to have deep respect for those that we're documenting and be invited by tribal people to come on board and, you know, document what they're doing. But to do it with very limited resources is staggeringly difficult. I oftentimes joke that this show is made for like 1/10 the craft budget of an episode of Game of Thrones or something much more conventional. So, you know, you'd almost like, your jaw would drop as to how little money we made this second episode for, just because it came about very kind of unusually and on the fly. But, you know, big challenges stem everything around that, around logistics, getting it to happen, you know, finding the right people to practition with or to focus on, which, you know, Rat can highlight more. But every episode is this monumental undertaking, and it's a huge life growth process to do each one as well. And it's like a pilgrimage. It's just like, it's brutal, it's difficult, it's hard, it's challenging. It's like something that, you know, when we got the invite to do this second episode from this group in Tijuana who knows the marakame, and Edgar, you saw there, was the main kind of vector to access Don José and, you know, go on this very special pilgrimage on this very unique time of year that they only do once annually. That was something that came about very last minute. So we kind of had to scrounge it together very quickly. And that, you know, we had very little production time, or pre-production time, I should say. So we just kind of did it on the whim. But, you know, we kind of find that we're supported in these processes. So, you know, there's many steps along the way that it takes to make it happen. But when you initially get the invite to go on a pilgrimage or to go on this really brutally rough journey of camping in the Mexican, you know, desert, you know, it's going to be difficult. And it's like, oh, at first you're like, oh, I don't know if I necessarily want to do this, or how difficult it's going to be. But you know that it's like any mountain climbing experience or anything that's analogous to walking the yellow brick road of a difficult challenge, that it's worth it after you do it. So we find that every episode is hugely worth it to do it.
Yeah, you know, Niles hit on some really good points there, just to give some context. This is it's a marriage between filmmaking and shamanism. So doing a documentary series on shamanic earth medicines and consuming the entheogen during the shoot, you know, is very unlike traditional Western media. I remember Lisa Ling from CNN, who reported on ayahuasca about 3-4 years ago, wasn't allowed to take ayahuasca, you know? And so I've always, from the outset, realized that what I wanted to do as a media maker, reporting in print and in film about these substances and these experiences, is there's no separation. You can't really talk about the in-depthness and the soul of these experiences without having experienced it. So that in itself is a challenge, and why we are independent and we make this without a network behind us, although we're very happy to sell our content on to get it out to more mainstream audiences. But in doing that, you know, the shoot itself, I mean, essentially it was Niles and I and Tom, you know, was helping us. It's very small, our crew, but that also enables us to insert ourselves in and embed ourselves with the ceremonies and with the tribe and with the people, that we're not a huge production outsiders. We're part of them. We're joining their energetic. We're joining them on the pilgrimage, in this instance with episode 2. And it was really grueling. It was like days in the desert, in the hot desert, and at night, and hardly any sleep. Because, you know, what you don't see a lot in that episode in context is that Don José, beautiful, you know, man and marakame and spiritual leader, but relentless prayers, relentless like on the roadness, relentless like praying and doing, and it was just, you had to keep up. He would be off, and you know, you just have to keep up. And so, you know, there's pre-production, a little bit of research and things like that, exploring the context of their culture. But really, and the way I like to work is really, you know, I used to call it gonzo journalism, and now I say experiential. And it's really in the flow, and it's being open to spirit. So, you know, you stack the deck a bit in the, you know, in a contextual way as a writer and a filmmaker, what you're looking for in shots and what the beats are, but you're open to what comes. And that really creates a free form spontaneity where you can actually be vulnerable in the moment, and you can see what happens, and you don't know what's going to happen. So it's really experiential filmmaking, which allows spirit to come through. And that's really what we're trying to capture, you know, in the work.
It's tough too, Danielle, because this series is, you know, it's so sensitive, this material, and we don't discount that. I mean, there's been 2 great questions already in the chat about sensitivities with, you know, indigenous traditions, which we'll get to, and, you know, being invited and not being somebody that's trying to speak on behalf of them. And you eloquently said in the introduction that we don't have a representative here from the Huichol tonight. but it's just to try and be deep respect to the medicines as we know, to the context, to the ceremony, and to the people. And that is something that we'll always try and honor. And that's difficult, you know, because we've had challenges. I mean, there was huge challenges with the first episode where it was very paradigm destroying. And to some extent, it seemed like none of the networks would touch it with a 1,000-foot pole because of how paradigm destroying it was and how much we had, you know, we learned a lot doing it. And we've grown a lot from becoming more mature through the process. So I think each episode, if we do an episode, how often, hopefully they'll get continuously better because there is some spacing with them and we learn through that process, as Rack said. So still,
you know, that's interesting. Did you guys see that Netflix has released the psychedelic, documentary on psychedelics, but it's all comedians and all Hollywood people telling trip stories, which is nothing necessarily wrong with that. But yet again, what I feel is happening in Western culture, in global culture now, is that, you know, through great work through many of the not-for-profit NGOs like MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Social and Psychedelic Studies, which is for 35 plus years now been lobbying the government in America and, you know, getting the science and the accreditation to prove the efficacy of psychedelics as medicines. So that there's a paradigm shift happening in the West where, you know, the legalization of marijuana, psilocybin's next, MDMA in therapy, all these things are sort of dovetailing together where we're no longer in this 60s sort of ripple effect where we're worried about like this psychedelic revolution. It's about a renaissance of these medicines within the establishment in Western culture. However, shamanism is still outside the pale. It involves something different than the medicalization of psychedelics. It involves spirit. It involves a sense of soul. It involves a sense of journeying into other dimensions, which can't be proven by science. You can read with EEG your brainwave activity, which I've worked with neuroscientists and 5-MeO, and they can say what's happening in what areas of the brain, but they can't show you with science what you feel on the inside with these medicines, this feeling of oneness, this feeling of connection, this feeling of potentially the divine. You know, these words, these religious archetypal words can't be still proven in the Western medical scientific paradigm. And yet that is sort of what the whole reason is for these experiences, is to connect us to the great being, to the web of life, to this sense of community, within ourselves and within nature. And so the shamanic resurgence, revival, this whole paradigm is still so a little bit further out there that even Netflix and platforms in media, which are really falling over themselves to document, you know, 6 Westerners in search of healing with PTSD go down to the Amazon to receive ayahuasca. Great. I really support that. And it's still safe, where pretty much the stuff we're doing isn't safe because it's real and it's showing real experiences, which can be very visually out there, but also hard to nuance. It's very difficult to capture on film the spiritual experience, almost impossible. So you have to use your filmmaking techniques to use narration and use whatever footage you get to hint and to suggest at the ineffable and to the thing which we're all talking about but can't show to the viewer. We can sort of aggregate around, and hopefully it creates a sense of mystery, the great mystery, and that we can give context to it. But it's something which can maybe induce or encourage people to feel and to think about themselves and to find their own paths to that central source.
Absolutely. I really appreciate, Rack, how you spoke to the difficulty of capturing the spiritual experience on film. And I'd love to just dive deeper into that a little bit more and hear about how was your experience with peyote, and can you describe some of the spiritual experience that you might have experienced?
Go ahead, bud.
Yeah, well, I'll go quick, and then Niles can say something too, because he has a more visual appreciation in his filmmaking techniques. You know, in the context of the shoot, it was 3 hard days, and by the time we got to the end of that ceremony and that night with like no sleep for 2 days, I took the dose they gave me, but I didn't double up or anything. And I was really tired. So, you know, I found over the years, if I'm in ceremonies and I'm tired, I just relax a lot, and it's more quietening the mind and opening the heart. But it was beautiful in the sense that you know, and we say it in the film, it's a group prayer. It's a ceremony where men, women, and children of the community. This is potentially the difference with the West. There's no shame. Not only no shame and no stigma of the Richard Nixon war on drugs instigated in 1971. There's a sense of openness and a sense of belonging, a sense of being home with the tribe as you take the medicine. So that was a really good set and setting to do the peyote medicine in. And at the culmination of the pilgrimage, for putting in all that hard work, it felt really rewarding. So I had a similar sense maybe that I've had on other entheogens like ayahuasca sometimes, that sense of, for me, feeling versus visuals. It wasn't a heavy visual experience, where it can be if you're on the right dosage, and Niles, I think, can talk more about that. But for me, it was all about this sense of feeling and feeling reconnected to, through the portal of my heart, to all of nature, to this oneness, to this feeling of connection. And it really felt as if I could feel nature. And it felt like that the individuality of all of us is like, is all sort of like notes in a larger song. And because the marakames are playing that wonderful violin music with, essentially, you know, I use a lot of, in the film, I heard myself say the word Pachamama 5 times, which is a Peruvian tradition. I didn't really have the connection or the context of the Huichol word for the world or the world soul, or, you know, but for me, it's like saying Gaia, which is a Western term, but from the Greek, and Pachamama is a Peruvian, Mesoamerican type of term. But that collective understanding of the world or the life force of the planet, and something that you feel. So I really deeply, intimately felt a connection to the planet and to an aliveness, that it wasn't just this amorphous sort of like collective word. It was made up of all of us, and that we were all like notes in a song with all that violin music and like the icaro, like the vibration of their song in that ceremony, which was transmitting an energy and weaving together through all of us as our hearts were opening. And that as our hearts were opening, it's like our hearts were the notes in a song, a collective song, and that song was like the world song. And so these are things that you feel, and these are things which can be deeply meaningful to you, but might not sound that dramatic to someone else. But it's something you have to experience, and it's something which the ceremony gives you a set and setting and a container to experience and to unite us all together. And so that was really that heart opening and that interconnection between all of us and the web of life, which was very profoundly felt for me with the grandfather medicine and peyote.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think probably most episodes of the show, if not all episodes, will feature Rack probably partaking in the ceremony. And I'm, of course, kind of the guy behind the camera, but I do find myself at the end of the shoot partaking in it a little bit as well. And I think in the Carlos Castaneda novels, you know, he was speaking that Don Juan would have him take a mescalito in these, you know, a lot of buttons, a very quite heavy amount of buttons. So I found myself eating a few buttons on the night as well after we were basically done shooting that ceremony. And it's a beautiful, beautiful experience. I think that, you know, a lot of people talk about ayahuasca being very feminine. I found it to be a very masculine experience. And it was very visual because I happen to be such a visual person. But it was very much like, you know, this greater high frequency overlay of the desert, where you see this kind of sentient, you know, sci-fi biodiversity of everything. So it's like you put on your augmented reality goggles and everything switches into the most like saturated, luminous, alive version of itself, from what is usually this kind of dim, dull, gray, you know, kind of sad, dry looking cactus turns into this amazing totem of a wonderful saturated creature that's interacting with you and giving you data. And that is a beautiful experience to have. And I can see why the Huichol people have such vibrant, beautiful, saturated, you know, dress, and how they choose to portray their many, many eons of this peyote experience through the legacy of what they externally put on their clothing. But yeah, I mean, it's a beautiful experience. And like Rack hinted on, you know, this show, the idea with it is to always encapsulate that spiritual aspect of it. Because there are some other great documentaries out there, of course, for sure. And there's other networks that have touched on very psychedelic things, you know, like Vice we can think about, but it's almost like a lot of it's so despiritualized. It's about some tripping or, you know, taking something in your scuzzy, you know, Chicago apartment without any sort of proper context or ceremonial respect. And you can see the first half an hour of this entire episode is basically Don José doing magical rituals around these various sacred sites of like the earth, the air, the fire, and the water. doing blessing, and it's all like container setup for this amazing experience. And as we know, there is a big separation with the spiritual ecology of things when it's in a shamanic container. So that's something that we'll always try and retain through the episodes as well, is the spirit and the container and that legacy of the history of training.
If anyone wanted to go to shamanstheglobalvillage.com and download the 3-hour media content episode, there's some extras in there, the director's cut where we do narration. But there's also this great audio podcast that Niles and I did where we talked about the visuals a lot. And, Niles has his great ability as a filmmaker working and doing rendering and post-production to use this special effects linguistical language to talk about resolution and frame rate and to apply, those optics to the psychedelic visual experience, which is really unique. I've not really seen that in much of the also the psychedelic culture that has the language to break it down in comprehensible special effects sort of language. But in that, what I realized is that and this would be applicable to psychoactive medicines that are visionary, like the Peyote and like the DMTs. It felt to me that in Niles and I's conversation, you can hear in that podcast, that it's almost as if the earth is, it's all alive, and that the plants and the mountains and everything has a unique energetic signature. And we're sort of trapped in this, I mentioned in the film Default Mode Network, and this channel of reality, in our consciousness. But it's also a UV light spectrum that when you open up on these medicines, you're shifting not just your vibrational state and your channel of your egoic consciousness to open up to the vast spectrum of reality, which is there in the other channels, but your ability to see. And so what we're seeing, I believe, and this is my interpretation, is that on things like peyote, what we're seeing in a visionary state with closed eyes is the energetic signatures of the other living creatures of nature, which are there, but they're on an energetic level in the UV spectrum because they're alive and they're not necessarily random. That you're sort of seeing a representation of the landscape around you and the living creatures, which is shifting and morphing and changing, as you're witnessing it. It's a really interesting train of thought to go down. And it almost feels like we potentially have the technologies now, if we were to apply them to the spiritual experience, to capture and to mediate and understand a bit more of what is going on those visual levels.
Well, that sounds so unique to be able to capture that experience. And I feel like you two captured some incredible parts of that experience, such as the sacrifice and how the sacrifice, cultivates the sacred, and really showing the community and the lineage that we're presenting in this film. So I have one last question, and then we will take questions from our community. This is sort of a two-part question. What are your plans for the series overall, and how can the viewer help the Huichol people?
Do you want to talk about the series, and I'll hint on the other part, Duke?
Yeah, so, essentially, it was sort of as we described before, Niles and I do this with our own resources as independent filmmakers, which means we don't have a lot of money to do it. So we rely upon the community, and we're growing our mailing list, and we're really asking everyone not just to help us support the show by downloading and buying the episode, but to spread the word in their networks if they enjoy what they see, and to encourage people to join our global village community as filmmakers. So the idea is there are indigenous traditions and earth shamanic psychoactive medicines all across the planet. A lot of them are concentrated in countries like Mexico. There's another potential episode there with psilocybin mushrooms and maybe even Salvia divinorum. It's funny because geographically, they're all around the planet, but with climate change and with cultural change, there are clusters where there's more predominance of psychoactive medicines with traditions that are still extant. We hope to get to Gabon in Africa to work with the Iboga root bark and the Bwiti tribe that are there. We hope to get to Peru, and we're going to be working with ayahuasca and San Pedro cactus. We were hoping to get there in July this year, but with coronavirus lockdowns, it's going to have to be next year. There's things like the Amanita muscaria mushroom in like Lapland, in the Arctic, which would be an amazing episode, to do over there. But to do that, we need we need the resources to take our small crew, which is about 5, filmmaking crew with the audio, the different people that we work with, cinematographers. We work on the most lean budget there is. We pretty much essentially don't really get paid to do this. We get paid to cover our costs, and we do some crowdfundings when we're launching each episode to cover the flights and the logistics and things like that. And we might pre-sell the episode to our mailing list. So, we're trying to grow that, and we're trying to nurture that. And we believe that the quality of work we're doing is really deserving of that support. So we have the vision to go globally with this. We've done 2 episodes in Mexico, and we've been invited. It's just happened that way. But there is a global scope, and there's about 12 episodes in all. And maybe Niles will put up, we've got an episode info pack which lists the different medicines around the planet and the countries they're going to be in, to give the community an idea of what the scope is and what we're planning. And we really want to do that. If we could do 1, even 2 episodes a year, that's still going to take another 6 years at a minimum to get this done. So it's a long-term effort, and I think it's good to do that. It's quite unique in filmmaking, because we're asked to come. We're vetting the people we work with, and we're researching the communities, and we're not sort of like trying to rush into getting 12 episodes done in a year, to pump it out for Netflix. Although we'll be open to Netflix. And with that support we could. So it's a community effort, and we hope that we can show the scope of global shamanism. And we saw with this episode with Don José, his style was very different from Octavio Redig in episode 1, and different lineages, or different lack of lineage in episode 1, and a very traditional lineage in episode 2. And episode 3, we're hoping to work with the San Pedro Cactus in the Sacred Valley of Peru. And again, that would show the lineage of the curanderos that work there with it, and with a Western practitioner who is part of their lineage. And each episode is going to have a little bit of a different sort of tweak to it, because there's so many different aspects to global shamanism now. But what we feel is the basics is these medicines come from the earth. They have been caretaken by the role of the medicine man or woman in their indigenous community. We want to feature both indigenous medicine people and this new wave of Western practitioners who have have an indigenous lineage, have the permission of the indigenous peoples, and are training either as Westerners or modern indigenous people, and are bringing it out into the world. There's lots of different angles and lots of different nuances to explore. So we really look forward to doing that in the years ahead.
Yeah, and to address your other question, Danielle, because that's almost like the most important question of this entire evening, is like there's no real simple answer to talk about how we can all put one foot forth to help indigenous people, because the Huichol are one of about, I think it's like a dozen tribes, Rack, in Mexico that are indigenous. The Seri were the tribe that we featured in the first episode, and it's almost like any answer to how we can be part of a solution instead of part of a problem. For how indigenous people move forward is kind of applies to indigenous people all over the world, right? Because we see that they're so impoverished, and basically they had a traditional way of life based upon barter, but because of the intrusion of imperial dominant culture, their way of life has been really shattered, and it's very much like a crumbling house of cards. Most of them have little to no money. I was just reading an article that they don't even have money to buy soap, a lot of the Huichol, and they might have a potential problem with the latest lay of the land with the dynamic of coronavirus perhaps spreading through the community, or like many people in corporate crony gangster capitalism today that are in struggle and subsistence, and massive misdistribution of wealth problems, where like 6 people have half the wealth on the planet, while millions and millions of people are just absolutely in abject poverty and struggle. Indigenous people are obviously seem to be on the bottom of the totem pole a lot. So in terms of something like COVID-19, when they were already struggling, and now something like COVID is making it even more economically difficult for them. So without just saying like it's something where we could throw money at them and give them PayPal, send them a PayPal, even though that is an immediate thing that we are going to be doing for like the proceeds of this, for example, to help Don José and his immediate tribe. There's 30-some thousand Huichol in the mountains, in that area of Mexico. So I think it's more of the dynamics of a very multi-leveled approach of like including indigenous people in the discussions of land use, applying laws that ensure land rights are protected. We hear dynamics where some indigenous leaders trying to speak at the latest like United Nations discussions, and they're not even allowed in, which is obviously very gross and misaligned and off balance. And, you know, we have lacking equilibrium in terms of giving indigenous people the right spokesman level of speaking on, you know, their territories and their lands and how affected they've been. But then also, I mean, it's just basically not aiding in this kind of commodification of the elements we see. We're like, we just had an episode that you saw where Don José is working with all these elements in a very like specific ceremonial way. And then, you know, he's working with the water at this very sacred site, and then Nestle's trying to sell us corporate water, stuff like that. So this, you know, hierarchical centralization of the gross dynamic of what's going on with systems from the top down that are really not benefiting most people. It's like, it's almost like we just need to get back to remembering, like Rack says, doing ways that more indigenously aligned with chopping wood and carrying water and permaculture and biodynamic farming and these things that are kind of thinking globally, acting locally. And I think those types of things will more long-term have us 1 foot into the system and 1 foot out, so that it's more like we're living in slightly indigenous ways as we still move forward with certain things on the leading edge technology-wise. So it's a really complex issue, and I don't have a really beautiful, like, simple answer. But, you know, it's a much bigger discussion. And some of the comments I've seen have really raised good questions about it.
Absolutely. And how can we, you know, develop a type of reciprocal maintenance where we're giving back to the indigenous communities on a level that's consistent and not just, you know, a one time? And how can we develop that relationship, that ongoing relationship? So I'd love to start to incorporate some of the questions from this incredible crowd here tonight. And I'd like to start off with Ian's question. The question was, are we assuming that culturally specific terms like Pachamama and shaman have universal application? And does that actually honor the traditions in which these terms belong, or does it detract from them?
Good question. What a question. Do you want to speak to that, Rack? You've spoken to that before, I know. Oh, or can...
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm on. Well, this is a fundamental question. Thank you, Ian. And I think it's pretty answerable, frankly. So words, they're just words. And words are powerful. Words can harm, words can hurt, and words can heal. So we have to be careful with our words. So essentially, all the indigenous cultures have their own languages and they have their own words for this. And that's why in this show, we use as an overarching word the Western construct of shaman. And, you know, this comes up a lot online and different aspects. It's complicated in the sense that the Western culture, or what has evolved into the Western culture, and when we say the West, it goes all the way back to about 1000 AD when Constantinople got taken, and what was west of Constantinople became Western culture versus the Eastern culture. You know, history is full of the absorption of language. And so modern Western culture, you know, basically in an anthropological sense, created the archetype of the shaman from Mercy Eliade in his book Shamanism, which came out around late 40s, early 50s. And it's come from the Siberia Saman, the word Saman or medicine person for their community, who didn't even use psychoactive substances. And that classic book, which is still the cornerstone book on shamanism today, didn't really represent plant or earth medicines because it had a 1950s prejudice against altered states, which goes back to the churches and, you know, what they did in the old world when they discovered plant medicines is they slaughtered, you know, the populaces which practiced it and thought it as the work of the devil and witchcraft because of their own prejudices. So again, the language is all embedded within this historical narrative. So you know what? I love the word shaman. I really like it. It's powerful. And I don't find anything wrong with it, but I think embedded within the etymology of that is the historical stain of what we did to the indigenous cultures and to the medicine people, whether they called them marakames or curanderos or brujos or whatever, right? So I think that you look at what the West does, it homogenizes everything. So we have this blanket term shaman, which gives a blanket term understanding for this archetype that the West had almost eradicated from the old world because it was threatened by it, of essentially 3 or 4 things. A shaman is a medicine person. It's potentially a healer, a walker between the worlds, a priest. There's all these trace elements of different archetypes of what the role of the shaman is. But, you know, there's been so much discussion over the decades of, do we call it something else? There's been this political correctism of trying to step around the whole thing. Just, I'm very comfortable with the word shaman. And for me, it's like saying wizard or warlock or sorcerer. There's these archetypes of magical realism that we don't understand in the West because we killed our medicine people, our herbalists, our witches, our warlocks. And so I like shaman. I like the word. I understand that it is often bandied around and used in the wrong context and used as an easy label for the neo-shamanic Western movement, which has commodified shamanism and just hustling into ceremonies on weekends and blowing people's minds and having a lot of fallout. That's a cultural issue. But in terms of linguistics and in terms of the etymology and things like that, I don't mind it. And to me, you know, as I said, thank you, Ian, I saw in your comments, I use the word Pachamama quite a lot. And, you know, it's potentially out of context in this episode talking about the Mexican Huichol tradition, but I didn't have a word in their language for Pachamama, that has been absorbed into my lexicon, like the word Gaia, which we also used in the show. And so I think that, you know, the more words, and you could say, is this cultural appropriation? Am I appropriating the word Pachamama? Am I appropriating the word Gaia? I think if I use it with respect, and that if I use it, you know, in the right context and give context to it, I think that we're all children of the one planet, and that we need to use language to get beyond language and back to the heart. And so these are complex issues that we've touched upon just in this one discussion. And there's no easy answers, but I think we need to share a common language and to give respect to where that language has come from and the history and the blood and the turmoil, which is all embedded in that journey. So, yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you, Rack. So we have about 7 questions, and I'm just going to be reading them off in the order that they were received. The next question is from Peace and Love in St. Paul. Question is, how often are these ceremonies held, and what can we do to help protect indigenous medicines and lands from far away, which I know we covered a bit.
Yeah, this pilgrimage is done annually where they do the collection, which is what we saw. So I think they're carrying these massive amounts of peyote back to the tribe. And then do you know how often back in the tribe, Rack, they're partaking in the medicine? Is it something they do infrequently, or? I would think it's a special.
So again, I mean, peyote is a special, they're all special medicines, but in the cultural context, because it's endangered, and, you know, there's a lot more coverage of the endangerment of peyote in the American tradition of the Native American churches and, you know, their usage. But in the Huichol tradition, they go on these pilgrimages once a year in mid to late March to get enough peyote for their communities for the year. And they take the peyote regularly in their communities for different ceremonies because they sacralize everything, births and deaths and growing crops and different aspects. It's not something that is separate from their everyday life. So they need a lot of the material. And so just in brief, we were very privileged to go along, and there's this sort of awkward fit in a way between these indigenous communities doing what they need to do to retain their traditions and to teach their next generations and to have enough for themselves. And yet they do also open it up to within their networks and people that are interested in a very small degree. There are other Westerners who would pay to go on some of those pilgrimages, or they would conduct ceremonies for Westerners who are interested. And this is what we've seen springing up with ayahuasca, with psilocybin, with all the medicines, is that we're taught about these things, we're shown these things, we're told they exist. How do we get access to them? So, you know, if you have an opportunity to do so through the interface of an indigenous person who has the permission and knows the lineages and holds a sacred ceremony, then I think that is the way to do it. You know, you're not stealing the peyote, you're not going out. You can't go out to, for instance, Wirikuta. You need a permit, and it's sort of policed, and it's protected on many levels. But how do we engage with these medicines? So a lot of indigenous peoples have seen this power dynamic shift where they are engaging with Westerners and asking for a financial exchange. And that's necessary for them, and that's regulated by them, so it's not out of control. But it does bring up a lot of teething issues about supply and demand, which are still being regulated, you know, in the global village.
And that's something that we'll probably hint on always, is just the ecological dynamics of sustainability of medicines. And, you know, yes, there's not enough to go around for a lot of people. And like, if the tribe is doing it in their lineage of how they have always done it through the eons, it's like, that is something that we want to respect. But then, you know, here we are, there's probably a shot or two in the episode where they're cutting the root of the peyote way too deep and not doing it sustainably, right? So this is something that we're conscious of. We're also, I don't think this is necessarily a question and to bring up a new topic, but we're also very conscious of balancing this out really well with feminine practitioners to make sure that there's an equal dynamic of male practitioners, and then, you know, beautiful, divine moon, alchemical moon, female energy as well in this series, right? So you have a equal dynamic of not just a patriarchal thing where it's all about the guys all the time, but we show, you know, amazing female practitioners as well in their natural landscapes with, you know, tribal heritage. So a lot of themes, reoccurring themes that we're finding through this process.
I really appreciate that balance, and
yes.
Look forward to seeing future episodes. So we have another question from Ian. It's about, how do we ensure that Indigenous meaning and context is not lost as their traditions are embraced by the global village?
You asked the hard questions, Ian, and I like that. Thank you. You know what and again, there's no easy answers, but you know what I suspect is that community means common unity, right? And that as we have our first blush, our first encounters with Indigenous communities who are caretakers of these medicines, we stay in contact, you know? And so, you know, I first did ayahuasca about 3 months in Australia before I went to Peru and did it in the Indigenous Shipibo sort of tradition. And I love the Shipibo tradition, and that's how I choose to do ayahuasca. I don't really enjoy the Western ceremonies where they sing more Bajan medicine songs, but not the Icaros with the power and don't have the cultural context. But even within that, when there's those very rare Western practitioners that have studied with the Shipibo and know the Icaros and understand and have been taught the ceremonial structure, even then, how do we know that they're absorbing the right cultural lessons without the dogma? Or how do we know they're doing it right? We don't. You know, you develop a relationship and you trust that relationship. And, you know, there's many instances in Western culture, both with Indigenous practitioners and Western practitioners of all different medicines, of things going wrong, of ceremonies going wrong, of improprieties, of sexual predatorness or power dynamics or money or, you know, things like that. And again, this is about relationships. So your relationship with your practitioner, your curandero, whatever they call themselves, your relationship with the ceremony, how that was going, your relationship with the traditions that were presented in that ceremony, your ability to learn, your ability to be taught by the practitioner and not just treated as, you know, a client that is there paying their money and shut up and take your medicine. It's all about relationships. So what I've found over the 15 or 16 years I've been in the shamanic world, mainly with ayahuasca, and now with peyote and 5-MeO-DMT and the Sonoran Desert Toad, and that my pilgrimage and my journey and my relationships are continuing. And so, as Niles mentioned before, this coronavirus has really affected everyone around the world. And, you know, I just did a GoFundMe campaign for my Peruvian maestro, you know, Percy Garcia. And I just got outreached with Edgar, who's in this episode 2 film, saying that the Don José and his village in Contamana has been, you know, really affected by the virus and the lack of tourism and the lack of interaction. And, you know, we're donating some money from this film, but the relationships are continuing, and the connections between the Indigenous cultures, the style of ceremonies are often quite similar in the sense of the set and setting, the idea of a container, the idea of a ritual, the idea of songs driving the ceremony. The nuances might be different, but there's a lot of overlap. And, you know, what I learned a long time ago in Peru, they told me that the teachers are not just the humans or the people that are the caretakers of medicines, it's the spirit in the medicines themselves. And so I believe that as Westerners engage and learn from indigenous cultures, we're also being taught by the original teachers, by the spirits in the plants, if you believe that paradigm, and I do personally. And that they will teach you how to work with these medicines. They will teach you how to set up the right frameworks for a ceremony. And you have to be willing to learn. You have to be willing to listen. And so then I think the relationships is what it's all about, that if you're open to listening, if you're opening to being taught, you will continue to absorb the lessons from the indigenous people with respect and keep your pathways open to give back to those cultures, to support them in their struggles to survive even, you know, and then also to the teachers inside the plants and inside the medicines, and listen to them and be taught by them. And that's how this global shamanism evolves.
That's what I mean. Even though we see the struggles of indigenous people, and having gone into 2 tribes now and seeing how just battered down they are, they do have that beautiful animism that shows them that speaks to what you just spoke to, where they see that process and have much more harmony with the, you know, Gaian cosmos. And even though they are in struggles, their spirit is not broken. It's beautiful to see that huge struggles, still a lot to work on, but you see the benefits of their experiences with the medicine. And I know that a criticism of like the psychedelic experience from other areas of what you might think of as traditional religion, even in some occult circles, there's really critical aspects of psychedelic experience as just being, you're just a passive spectator. But to add to what Rack's saying, I think it's like almost like an extension of eating your vegetables. It's like the plants are teaching you something that isn't just passive. It's like you're learning, you're getting data download from somewhere that's hugely beneficial and hugely expansive to your consciousness. So that, I think, is something that you see, you know, even though indigenous people have this weird equilibrium they have to find these days, we still see that from our experiences and from, you know, what you see from learning from them and their teacher plants as well, or medicines, earth medicines.
That's beautiful. Thank you, Niles.
Yeah.
I have a wonderful question from Natalie. How do you share the message of responsibility for the use of hikuri peyote by respect, protection, ceremonial, and not promoting only to consume?
Yeah, sustainability is so key in this dynamic. You know, I know that's like number one is how is this going to be something that can continue to be done 50 years from now? And those are big question marks, right? So I think that, I mean, I know that when we went out there and documented their harvest, and we've learned not to call these things hunts, you know, they're not hunting for medicine, they're sustainably harvesting the crop, you know, knowing that it's something that hopefully year after year will continue to be there, even though with climate change, like we said in the episode, it's questionable about how often we can see these things persisting. These are really great questions that don't have really simple answers. It's kind of like, I'm really surprised by how excellent these questions are, but that's kind of my initial just 2 cents on what could be a 45-minute discussion to answer.
You know, I'd like to say as well that we're filmmakers, and in a sense, we're very privileged to drop into these communities and these experiences. And we're not just filmmakers that don't have a spiritual understanding. We're a bridge between the 2 worlds. But this is, again, you know, there's no easy answers here. It's about relationship, and it's about, well, what you're really asking is, where do I fit in? Where can I contribute? Where can I find this community? So here you have the Psychedelic Society of San Francisco. And tomorrow, I believe they're hosting another Huichol community event, which gives another pathway in. I know that there's other interfaces in the West, other organizations like Chacruna.net, you know, out of San Francisco with Bia Labate, who's been doing a series on Peyote, more than North American, Native American churches. But there's pathways like that where there's avenues for ongoing discussions and representation by Indigenous voices. And then I think that's the first steps. And then what you'll find is as you make relationships, you might, like we were invited to go, and we've now got relationships with this tribe and these people, and those relationships don't stop. So, you know, then maybe one day you get invited to go down to Wirikuta or Mexico or the Amazon, or, you know, it's through relationships. So you take the interfaces where you get them, and then you work on how you can do it respectfully. So if people want to work with peyote, again, you know, we see in Western shamanic sort of, you know, like call it the circuit, ayahuasca is being planted all over the world. There's, again, potential shortages even in ayahuasca in Peru, in some of the key areas. You have to now go upriver a few days to find ayahuasca because of the supply and demand. I know, you know, working with the iboga root bark in Africa, that is again endangered. The supply and the demand is dangerous, because we want these things to be accessible to people, but you can only grow as much as the earth can grow in the time it grows. And the same with peyote. So, you know, if you look at the Western medical model, you know, there's synthetic 5-MeO-DMT versus the toad. I saw that there's scientific ways now they've done these experiments where they can grow psilocybin gene spliced into yeast. And I mean, psilocybin mushroom spores grow pretty easily. So mushrooms is one of the most, you know, tangible ways to get en masse enough medicine out there for that substance. But the problem with the Western rollout on the sort of assembly line of lab-grown synthetic chemicals is there's the danger of the absence of spirit, of treating these things like drugs, of treating them just like something you consume, like the red pill. You take this and one size fits all. And so this is part and parcel of the indigenous thing. It's fantastic in the sense that the earth grows these substances, she secretes them, because again, it's about relationship, and you have to be part of that relationship. And these things are grown and come to fruition and are meant to be taken by humans, right? Because they fit our neural structures and the other mammals, you know? But it's like this about relationships. So she doesn't grow too much of the psychoactives, but again, we have these humans having this. It will find a balance, and if it precariously balances on the end of extinction, I think there are, you know, programs by NGOs and by people that care to preserve these medicines. But we need to ask these questions, and we need to develop protocols, and we need to engage with these substances in a sacred manner, and yet we need to engage with them, because this is the time of the sixth great species extinction. You know, it's like we don't have a generation left. And I'm not saying psychedelics or plant medicines are the only answer, but I think a re-sacralization and a re-engagement with the Gaian intelligence and realizing what we're embedded within, however you get that understanding, is fundamental to surviving as a species, to know our place in the web of life.
Absolutely. And we are the ones that we've been waiting for.
Yeah. And it's always darkest before the dawn, isn't it? It seems like through times of in very difficult struggle, it's like, you know, to know a problem is to half solve it. So once we can accurately identify what's really going on, it's like we're halfway there, I think, a lot of the time. So that's a dynamic where it seems like when we have so many hard times and so many people are in abject, you know, it seems like low on Maslow's hierarchy. Any day where you're not in complete struggle and subsistence is a good day. And that's something that we have to remember, that just to make this series is a gift for us. So we don't discount that, or, you know, to be able to do this is a huge beauty. So that's something that if we can share some insights, and hopefully is a piece of cinema that's entertaining and, more importantly, educational, and helps become a piece of illumination instead of just like the dark sorcery of what usually media is these days. So the Joker spirals of disinformation, then that's kind of the goal. So hopefully we can continue to do that process.
We hope so too. And thank you for this gift.
Yeah.
So there's a question from Samson. How can the average peyote/psychedelic user pay their respects to the cultures that these medicines come from?
That's similar to the other question. Well, you know, similar. There's a couple of ways, I guess. I mean, you know, with any medicine, and again, some are more endangered than others, like peyote specifically, probably 12 major, planetary entheogens we know of. Some things grow easier. The psilocybin mushrooms aren't necessarily endangered. There's many different strains. The DMT containing acacia plants, there's 35 different species in Australia. The trees are growing pretty healthy everywhere and around the world. Hayoma in the Middle East. Some aren't as endangered than others. And we've got to ask ourselves as media makers, the more we put a spotlight on these substances, the more people know about them, the more people, supply and demand, want to partake of them. So, there's criticisms on either side, but the thing is, this isn't a time for hiding anymore. It's not a time for these things to be underground per se, that they were being attacked and forced underground by the Catholic Church or the war on drugs, by the American administration. We're mature enough as a global civilization now to understand that we can change our consciousness, that we're free to change our consciousness, whether that's through breath work or through, meditation or through earth medicines. And so we're not suggesting that everyone who hears this message rush out to try peyote or the 5-MeO Sonoran Desert Toad or ayahuasca. But you deserve to know that these pathways exist. You deserve to know that they can open pathways in yourself that breath work alone is never going to. As the great Saint Terence McKenna once said, the psychedelic experience is part of the human birthright. Like, imagine going to the grave, never having had the sexual experience, the intimacy of opening up and realizing there's these capacities within you. Well, that's what the psychedelic or entheogenic experience can open in you, this appreciation that there's more, that you're not separate, that you're unique, you're sacred, and that the whole of existence is sacred, and that we really are utilizing, with the right respect to the indigenous cultures that are caretakers of these medicines as gatekeepers, we're utilizing these medicines in a specific way, not recreationally, and at a specific time, that maybe they're only used as an initiation, like many cultures use them at certain times in their development to initiate you into stages of consciousness. And then you realize that you're connected to something bigger. And that I believe that what the message of the plant medicines, what I've been getting from them over the years, is they clean us out. They quieten the egoic mind down enough that it can connect to the planetary intelligence, which is radiating its love out eternally, and help us to remember that we too are the medicine, that we can do this, that we produce some of the most strongest entheogens known of in existence, the tryptamines, NN-DMT, pinealine, 5-MeO-DMT in the lungs and the cerebrospinal fluid, that we can connect to the sacred, that we're designed to do this, but we just forgot in this cycle of history, his story. And that this is the gift of these medicines that we think are external to us, but they're not, because nothing is external. It's all this one great being. And we're going through this cultural teething generation now of what are the right ways to engage. How can we help indigenous cultures? How can we connect? When should we take these things? All very pertinent questions to ask, but they're all training wheels for this great mystery to reveal that we are the ones we've been waiting for, that we are sacred, and that we are the divine being having a human experience. Just like the ayahuasca vine is a divine being having an ayahuasca vine experience. That these neurochemicals are being placed there as backdoor access to connect to the enormity of existence and the sacredness. And so this whole conversation is part of developing the protocols of how we engage with these substances. And I don't have the answers. I just like to inspire.
Well, and it's true too that, in one of the ancient mystery traditions, which was that Samoth race, they would apparently bring the initiate in and say, are you ready to meet the divine? And you'd essentially walk into some room behind a curtain and it'd just be a statue with a mirror on it. Like you were the one that you'd been waiting for, which is that remembrance, right? It's kind of like in the same dynamic of the oracle at Delphi or the, mystery traditions that we saw with like the Kaikion at Eleusis, just telling us these things that we've forgotten, but we already know. So in terms of like daily spiritual practices, yes, maybe these things are to be done extremely rarely or just for one initiation, and that's kind of all you need. And then there's obviously subtleties that one can do from a daily meditation or some sort of ritual or affirmation, but those are subtleties. So this is something that these medicines are to be used very infrequently and with, you know, in this proper container for these much larger chrysanthemum opening moments, which should be just done very rarely. And then they're much more sustainable in that light. So much to discuss always.
Always much to discuss, and
yeah,
how these medicines can be, you know, utilized as a tool, and they're not the end all be all. We are the medicine, as Rack said.
Yeah, we're the medicine.
Exactly. There's a question from Mark. He was reflecting on the group. He said it seemed like kind of a small group. What is the current extent of participation at this ritual among the Huichol overall?
You know, that's a good point, because I guess there's some 30,000 Huichol. So we just saw a little, they're speaking to the group in the episode. We just saw a little section of this tribe, right? Because they go out on their pilgrimage in different chunks. So this is obviously just Don José and his immediate family. But there's been other documentaries that have highlighted much larger groups of the Huichol going out together. So this just happened to be a small section of a much larger, you know, starship of them.
Yeah, that's the annual pilgrimage in March, but as Niles said, that it's I think it's around 10,000 people existing in what identifies the Huichol Nation still. And of course, not all of them can travel the hundreds of miles back to Wirikuta in San Luis Potosi. So there's little, units to go out. And Niles said that's essentially Don José and his immediate family and supporters who went. And then there would be other villages from different villages going out at different times throughout that pilgrimage season when the peyote comes out. And it's more practical because, I mean, we had 2 little tour buses as well and a few cars, and that was just the way it did it to make it accessible and to keep it sort of practical.
This is a question from Seafox. Have you guys applied for any funding, and what has been the response?
I think we're masters of reaching out to people and getting what I call a vertical network, Danielle, you know, where you have less people that are very deep and sophisticated and enlightened that you connect with very substantively. And then this broad, shallow, kind of like J-Lo's Instagram baby pool of like millions of people that seem to know nothing about you or care about you. Some people are just not on the wavelength or the resonance, but we're seeing that to start change, right? Like when we made the first episode just 4 or 5 years ago, very few people even knew about this. And I think this is a rather sophisticated audience tonight that is on the wavelength, but to have it have more mass appeal, it seems like the gears are turning towards more people becoming more conscious to these things and seeing the appeal of realizing that it's a very contractive culture and these experiences can be very expansive. So they're interested in that expansion because of how, you know, lacking mundane culture is. So we're seeing things change in that regard.
Yeah, basically, we asked for funding from the community. And, you know, as we said, you know, like post Michael Pollan and his influential book, How to Change Your Mind, about 18 months ago, millions of North Americans and people in the world now understand that the psychedelic renaissance exists and that these substances are out there. But, you know, shamanism, as we said, is still a little bit more esoteric. And that we don't know, there's never been any great, you know, Facebook has never shared with us all the demographics of all the psychedelic societies and all the plant medicines and groups. You know, the NSA knows better than we do about what the size of our global community is. But it is a community. It's fragmented. It's sort of all over, you know, in different areas virtually. But there's an audience for this material now, and we find that it's easier to reach out to that audience and that community than to try to play the politics games of applying to like mainstream documentary funding, which we have dabbled in here and there, or networks, which we're still open to. I mean, our first film was on the Gaia platform and they've been great supporters. And I think they're going to hopefully take up episode 2 as well in the series as it moves forward. And so, you know, we develop relationships with platforms and groups and communities as we move forward. And it's the same as the indigenous people. We ask for help. And we keep doing what we feel is necessary to make these documentaries and to represent spirit in a way where we can keep our editorial integrity, that we don't have to be like Lisa Ling and not take ayahuasca, like, you know, that we can't really comment on the nuances of what's going on because we can't talk about, you know, the truth. We want to be able to talk about the truth. And that means that it's going to be out there for mainstream.
And we want to be able to document it, you know, as raw and real. Obviously, you know, the first episode had some very heavy duty stuff. This had a very sad scene with, you know, the sheep passing scene, which was very hard to film. And this is stuff that, you know, we don't want to censor. We want to be very transparent about what we're seeing and be documentarians of how these people operate and how things are going. If we saw something horrendously unethical, that would be another story. But, you know, this is something that we're trying to do. And the subject matter is sensitive. And like I mentioned, it's like there's more people being interested in it, but it's still been a challenge to try and build networks outside of just, you know, the entheogenic community or the psychedelic community or something that's not knowledgeable about parts of what is really fundamentally esoteric content. It's funny, I always say that as what I do with my personal work is try and combine some level of high production values with some level of esoteric content. So it's like I'm 3 layers cubed of obscure. So to, you know, not have complete obscurity with what we're doing, we do see that it is growing. Things are growing a bit, even though it's not like if we wanted it to be massive numbers, we'd make a documentary about tomatoes or something. But, you know, this is the content that really, really is the leading edge. So we choose to focus on it and make empowering content instead of really depressing, glass half full, reactionary documentary content. It's like proactive, illuminating content.
And you know what I feel is that each episode, what we're trying to use the lens of the practitioner, who is the caretaker of their medicine and the connection to the indigenous lineage and then the connection to the earth, as the focus to talk about the larger issues of shamanism, plant medicine, and the interdimensionality it opens up, and the sacred. And that in documenting that in film, each episode is like a ceremony. You know, it has a ceremony in it at the heart of it somewhere, and that it's like the preamble leading up to a ceremony. And it's like each episode is like a ritual, and it's slightly different. I'm enjoying as the series progresses and trying not to repeat the same formula per se, but find different entry points into it. But realizing that we're taking viewers into a ceremony with each episode and we keep it sacred. That's what we feel. And so it's unique in the annals of filmmaking.
Yeah, I mean, you know, not to be all pushed, like promote-y about it, but we do feel there's nothing quite like this series. It's a little bit on the unique side of how it's done, you know, the research that Rack puts together. And then again, to kind of talk about the union of our skill sets, where I have a background working on this very high budget, extremely, you know, top level visual material. And then to try and put some level of that into this unique content is a recipe for longevity, where you are talking about very perennial philosophy or ageless wisdom with some level of professionalism in terms of the wrapper it's in. It means it's going to last and it's going to stand the test of time a bit. So that's at least the hope and the goal.
And giving the viewers an opportunity to, virtually attend that type of ceremony, which we wouldn't have access to. I appreciate that. And it's such a beautiful contrast of, like have a good trip where there wasn't any kind of ceremony or ritual or reverence in that and the description of the psychedelic experience. So I appreciate this series for truly highlighting on that.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks heaps.
So there's a 2-part incredible question around the survival of this plant. So what are the steps in place or that could be put in place to ensure the survival of the sacred plant? And why is Mother Earth not keeping up with the global demand of this medicine if it's essential to the greater divine plan?
Wow. Yeah, that is a very high level question. And
well, you know, there's goodness.
I was just going to say, I'll let you continue, Bud, but isn't there something with, you know, the secretion of the medicines across the planet? It's like we do see that peyote has spread itself a little bit naturally right into areas where obviously it's indigenous to one specific region, but we do find it's kind of mesh network spreading out a bit, although there are sustainability issues always. And we're seeing that with kind of all the medicines, right? Like they're spreading globally a bit more.
Yeah, there's no easy answers when it comes to this, because what it really points to is humanness and our culture and our civilization globally, and then, you know, specifically within each nation state or identity, and, you know, the history and the evils of what we've done to the old world and indigenous people still so impoverished. But specifically Peyote, Wirikuta is protected, they say, as we mentioned in the film, so you can't really just travel there easily as a Westerner. But then there's the issues again of this globalized corporate monetary interest, which is the silver mine and resource extraction, which is just colonialism all over again, right? And so we're seeing the same momentum of colonialism affecting shamanism and this extraction of indigenous medicines and how we connect them, and they can have this spiritual, you know, resacralization, but also a bastardization or a commercialization of the sacred. So peyote in Mexico, at least, it's sort of protected on the land on one level, although there's the commercial, you know, encroachment. In North America with the Native American churches, I know it's a whole different kettle of fish, that there's, you know, programs around probably both in Mexico and North America to preserve and graft and create conservation zones for the peyote. And that's the same with ayahuasca and other plant medicines. Is that the best a lot of people can do is to create conservation zones and protect the medicines and build up a reservoir of a medicine bank. But then if they just sit there, those medicines, then the plant survives. But the whole purpose of the plant or the cactus and this thing, which in the Gaian web of life, is to connect the humans as the apex predators back to the web, right? So if we're just random, like zombie apocalypse, ravaging the planet and devouring and killing not just peyote, but the whole web of life, we need a wake-up call. And these medicines have the potential to wake us up. So we need to protect them and preserve them, and we need to somehow engage with them to wake up. And as I said, they're not the only pathway, but they're a very dynamic pathway to wake up in a big way. But the other thing to realize is the supply and the demand is that the Gaian consciousness is intelligent. And why isn't she secreting more psychoactives? Well, we have this whole planetary transformation going on with the global warming, which is not just, it is obviously, you know, human related on the carbon dioxide we've been through our, you know, civilization and we've been putting into the atmosphere. But there's also, you know, there's a great book that came out a year or two ago called The Sixth Great Species Extinction, looking at what the Anthropocene age and the human impact on the environment. But there's been 5 species extinctions where 90% or more of 97% of species have been exterminated before. And then the world replenishes. It's a natural cycle. The planet doesn't die. She just goes through these larger world ages of, getting rid of a lot of the species and then rebirthing. It's like a winter, then a spring, then a summer on a larger tract of time. So in one larger sense, this is natural. And in a larger sense, we have this egoic attachment to survival. Great, obviously, it's good. I'm not saying we should die, but I'm saying the world is its own creature. And humans think we control the world, but we're just one species in the Gaian mix. And there's a larger intelligence and a larger evolutionary goal here, which I don't think we fully grasp yet. And I can't remember where I read this, but it might have been Terence or something ages ago. It was like, really, that Gaian intelligence, she sort of switches on and off in the Gaian circuit, what's needed when it's needed. And so, you know, we're seeing at the moment, not only is there like the global warming, there's the oceans are acidifying, they're warming, and that 0.5 degree of warming is creating more superstorms and cyclones off the coast. And then that's causing, you know, all these, it's all one planet having these cause and effect. And there's the fires in the Amazon and Australia, and that's adding more carbon dioxide to the air. Things are really transforming, right? Psychoactive substances as part of that to mediate the species. There's a pattern. There's a role for these substances. And someone once said, let's just say it was Terence because he probably did. Like if scientists, and there's something going around on the net at the moment where they're saying, oh yeah, they've figured out how to take LSD and switch off the bit which makes you trip, but still have the positive effects of a trip, or to do that with psilocybin or things. So they're reverse engineering to take away the entourage effect and the ability of these substances to have the spiritual experience, while still commodifying them in a psychedelic pharmacy with your therapist, $6,000 for 3 sessions on a couch in the Western capitalist model, right? But here's the thing. The Western culture doesn't believe in planetary intelligence. It doesn't understand that we're embedded in this larger organism that is actually controlling everything. And that if all the psychoactive substances were killed by plague, or that plague of locusts that are out there in Africa and Eurasia, as big as countries wide, sweeping, Eurasia at the moment, if ayahuasca disappeared off the face of the earth, if peyote disappeared off the face of the earth, it would be a tragedy in many ways for the indigenous communities which have been caretakers and have relationship with that exact spirit. But as we know, relationships come and go, and you can't attach, you can't hold on. You have to surrender and you have to trust. And so what I'm saying is, I believe, and what's gone round is that the Gaian intelligence can switch on in the genetic code and essentially switch on psychoactivity. So again, I can't remember the exact link here, but imagine if we wake up tomorrow and a tomato plant is psychoactive. Like, imagine if they mysteriously discover a species of tomato plant which is all of a sudden psychoactive. The need for the psychoactive substance will continue. And that we don't know why nature makes psychoactive substances. We know that they affect us when we take them, and that they seem to be interspecies mediators to open us up to a larger information transfer between species, and there's something bigger going on. So in that vein, I believe that the sacred and the substances which are psychoactive, which are sacred, and the humans which are sacred, that relationship will continue even if the peyote dies out, and the ayahuasca and all the other things. And maybe we will just become psychoactive as we are, but more ongoingly. I don't know. I trust the bigger plan. And I know that we also have to work towards it, and we have to preserve and conserve nature and these substances. And also, the more we discover who and what we really are, the more we surrender to the divine plan. Oh.
And trust in nature's wisdom. Has there been a synthetic variant created, or do you think using synthetic substances, but still within a sacred ritual, detracts away from the sacredness or experience of a natural plant from Mother Earth? And this is a question from Fox.
Yeah, a whole nother long conversation. There was a lot of discussion of this on the first episode with synthetic DMT versus the toad medicine. But yeah, that's also a question of experience. It's like this type of thing really lends down to somebody that's experienced both and can really speak to it, I think. But obviously, yes, in terms of synthetic, a lot of thought is that when people are replicating, then you can create a larger amount, isn't it? That's kind of the thought process.
Gordon Wassoon worked with Albert Hoffman in the 50s to isolate psilocybin from the magic mushrooms. And they gave it to Maria Sabina, and she was like, yeah, this does the thing, but it's like, her thing was, what about the spirit? It doesn't have the spirit in it, like the ninos, and that there's very subtle nuances energetically, vibrationally. In the ayahuasca tradition, you do dietas to cleanse your auric field, your vibration, and the busyness of your mind, so you're calm enough to be able to hear the spirits of nature, not just ayahuasca, but the spirits of the plants. And so the question is, can something made in a lab be spiritual? Yes, of course it is, because there's no separation. Nature doesn't stop at the lab. Nature's there with the scientist, in the scientist, and nature's working through the scientist to isolate these things. But what is the intention? So mescaline, for instance, which is, in the San Pedro cactus and the peyote as well, there's 23 different alkaloids in the main San Pedro cactus, and there's different varieties of San Pedro. When you isolate just one for the active psychoactive like mescaline, that's one of the oldest things that science has had since the early 1900s. And they've isolated that and had pure mescaline. And, Aldous Huxley used that pure mescaline extract to have his experiences that he wrote about in the Doors of Perception. And so there's not necessarily a separation of spirit in the isolated molecule, but there is potentially, without a lineage, without a container of ceremony, there's a potential to debase the usage of these substances, to take a synthetic substance in a recreational way. And I'm not against recreation. We've all done it and we've all discovered these pathways because of it. But, you know, in indigenous understandings, they understand that you are initiated in many tribal cultures at a certain age in your adolescence with psychoactives, so you know your place in the web of life. And so it's not recreational, it's instructional. And I believe that the West just doesn't have the initiation ritual. And that's why we're self-medicalizing ourselves with these substances, because we're trying to heal, we're trying to connect, but we don't have the other half of the equation, the instruction, the lineages, the set and setting, the ceremonies. So, you know, if the substance is pure and not debased, there's a lot of recreational drugs can be mixed with things, or polydrug usage, you know, or done in messy situations. It's not just the substance, it's the container, which is the other great gift of shamanism and the shamanic cultures, of giving us ceremony, of learning how to pray, like in episode 2 here, of realizing why you take these substances, how you take these substances. So it's all connected.
Well, it's also like a bigger philosophical conversation, like, you know, determinism versus free will, or something based upon, you know, the alchemy of how something is created by somebody in a lab versus like Gaia's nature, creating it as nature being the perfect teacher. But then is there really, you know, that's just one step removed from nature by being somebody in a lab having made it. So yeah, a lot there for sure.
Thank you. There is a lot there, and I wish we could do a whole topic on this.
We could have a 10,000 hour conversation.
Absolutely. There's a wonderful question from Kenyella. If your viewers can take away just one thing from watching this film, what would it be?
It would be probably indigenous people's connection to Gaia, divinity, and cosmos, you know, and not necessarily that order, and just that beautiful relationship with harmony of balance of nature, natural cycles, those types of things, and how that's something that we've forgotten in modernity. And that's what needs to be remembered if we are to continue on many moons into the future.
Yeah, I agree. However you like to split the definition, you know, where each episode is looking at a specific psychoactive substance used by a specific practitioner. But you know what I already know is that the experience you have is a reconnection to the divine and to life itself and to the planet and to the Gaian intelligence. And that is pretty common to all of these substances to different degrees. So there's, as well, if you look on the shamansoftheglobalvillage.com, as well as episode 1 and 2, we also listed the free excerpts that we've taken from sometimes the B-roll or sometimes the episode itself. And there's one great excerpt that I love from this episode. It's all in there in the episode. It's about, you know, 60, 90 seconds long. But the excerpt is called One Great Being. And that's really what I believe, whatever we call it, these labels, Pachamama, Gaia, the planet, you know, Earth. It's the fact that there's this intelligence which loves us and has created us and is us and is working through us for some really bigger evolutionary goal, which we're turning the corner of our egoic understanding of what that could be. Because when we still think of it from us, that it's all about us, we're not quite getting it. It's not all about us. You know, in 5-MeO culture, with that experience, there's a saying, they say, you are the center, and the center is everywhere, right? It's like, it's Indra's net. It's like the web of life. It's the web of being. And so that's what I think that to not confuse the finger which points at the sun with the sun itself, the takeaway from Shamans of the Global Village is that the sacred is everywhere, and that we honor that and we support that remembrance through our work.
I love that. Thank you. I just wanted to touch briefly upon that previous conversation we were having around practitioners, and there's been a theme of newer practitioners in the space sort of polydrugging people with different medicines, you know, throughout a weekend, you know, combo, bufo, ayahuasca, etc. And what are your thoughts on mixing sacred medicines?
You know, I'll let Rack speak to this. I'll just very quickly say there's these kind of 3 paths sometimes spoken of in terms of just like life philosophies. One's, you know, this descendant path, which is like if you're doing, you know, narcotics and living a life of crime. Most people we know, most of our friends and family are on somewhat of a latent path where they're just kind of going to their job and raising kids and doing the routines. But then there's the ascendant path, which is like these rare glimpses of gnosis that we might be lucky enough to see to lead us towards the mystery. And a lot of what you just said, like combining things, is not like ascendant type behavior to try and raise consciousness. It's just kind of like recreational party dynamics. I know that sometimes in very rare circumstances, like indigenous people knew some certain special combination of two plants that could amplify a specific breed of, you know, a brew or something. But for the most part, it seems like it's just more descendant type behavior to really do things like that. That's my kind of 2 cents on it, but you want to speak to that, Rack?
It's complicated again. You know, one day I really envisaged that maybe there could be like a planetary medicine council and we could all come together from all the different lineages and traditions and compare notes and share medicines. So essentially to answer your question, that is that there's a marketplace in the West of commodification of these substances. And in a way, inevitably, how do we connect to these substances? So, you know, Westerners who are utilizing them, serving different medicines in retreats or weekend or one-night ceremonies. Indigenous people who are doing the same, whether they're traveling through Western countries or people going to indigenous, own countries. There's a marketplace and there's a platform of engagement, which we're all still learning the teething issues of. And so many cultures have been caretakers of single medicines. Like if you work with, in Peru, you might be a ayahuasquero, which is just ayahuasca. You might be a vegetalista and you work with hundreds of plant medicines, including ayahuasca. All through South America, they use rapé snuffs. They use mapacho in combination with ayahuasca. That has a very synergistic relationship in ceremony. It's not new, but there's dangers in the Western way that we're doing it, and in the gung-ho, macho type of pilot-on type of attitude where, for instance, like the Matsis tribe who use sapo or cambo, as it's called in different areas, to clean out, that can have a very complementary effect with ayahuasca. If you do that first to clean out, then ayahuasca's not having to clean out your liver and do all the stuff in ceremony. If you space it apart, so in the retreats, what we're talking about is Western models of commerce working with plant medicines and then competing with each other to have the best or the most or go the furthest, And so some of these retreats might do cambo to cleanse out, ayahuasca that night, 5-MeO the next day, San Pedro the day out, and that's too much. That you don't need that. The wisdom is digest the first medicine before moving on to the second medicine. I think we just need to give space for that.
I interpreted the question as just kind of like combining to try and get more of a deeper effect instead of some lineage of, a light rapé smoking with the tribe when they were going, or a light rapé snorting to go hunting before the night of the ceremony, which is a different dynamic, right? So if it is in that lineage, that's different than, I'm trying to combine.
Well, and combining medicines at the same time can be very dangerous. And so there's sometimes tribes don't do that for a very specific reason. For instance, if you do cambo after 5-MeO, it's been discovered. And so this is another aspect, is that these medicines have been compartmentalized in the regions they've done in. And, the jungle peoples have never discovered the toad. And, I know that some people there's a pollination happening, even with just indigenous tribes, of medicines that have been kept separate. So they're discovering what works and what doesn't work. But again, there can be a beautiful interchange from tribal peoples to go, hey, we've got this medicine, to try it separately. But, there's been psychonautical trip reports of people smoking Salvia divinorum and doing NN-DMT at the same time. If you don't die, you're going to learn that was a pretty stupid move, right? Because you don't need to. You got to be careful. There's got to be exploration, but please go carefully. And that's another reason to work with indigenous frameworks and support to not kill yourself and not do things in the wrong way.
Mm.
And the power of integration too, afterwards, integrating with the community, with your friends, and with yourself, and the lifelong process that is our integration.
Yeah, the peak experience can be wonderful and visionary and like full on, but then the real homework, you know, because it shows you so much about yourself. It's not just that you're having this trip, that you're hurtling through a visionary experience. Quite often, a lot of your own subconscious material, a lot of your wounding, a lot of your stuff, it's heart opening. And it's like, you know, that's the point. It's not just one thing. There's a holographic sort of process going on where you're healing and you're opening and releasing, and then you're connecting to the earth, and it's all part and parcel of the relationship. And then afterwards, that integration can take years. So you don't need to rush on to the next medicine, because you're still figuring out what the benefits and what you've gained from that first experience is.
Dude, I'm still processing. It's my experience from episode 1, which was like the BCAD moment of my life. And that was 4 years ago.
It's a lifelong process.
Indeed.
So we're about at the top of the hour. I'd love to start to wrap up the evening. If there's any final notes or gems of wisdom, I know there's been so much wonderful information shared tonight that you would like to leave with our community. Rack, would you like?
Well, this has been a really beautiful gathering. So thank you to Danielle and the Psychedelic Society of San Francisco. And like, there were very good questions. So thanks to everyone who participated. And I hope that this question and answer recording can get out to a larger audience as well, because a lot of good questions were asked. And, you know, we just had to touch base on things, because this is part of what the show is about, that there is a global village, there is a resurgence in shamanism, and shamanism is not, it's not owned by any one culture. It's a pathway and a relationship, as we've said, to connect to the divine. And, you know, we encourage community around this. And that's what I'm seeing in the last decade or more, that there's been more, not just psychedelic societies, more not-for-profits and NGOs, more groups online springing up, more communities metastaticizing to support each other in the integration and in the exploration and in the outreach to this work. And so it's just begun. And so we really encourage everyone to stay in touch and to support each other as a community. And if we're, you know, the majority of us in the West are interfacing through the internet and the social medias, and it can be pretty cutthroat out there, and it can be pretty nasty sometimes. And so I just really reiterate that if you have felt, you know, your sacredness and the experiences, to allow the person that you've become, the integrity of your personality, to engage with our community and to go easy on them. And to give everyone the benefit of the doubt that if they're having a bad day or they're aggressive online, or this social civil war we're going through on planet Earth at the moment, the polarity of the weaponization of culture and of information, is like we're going through great planetary upheavals. And so just to remember that we are one people at the end of it, and that we need to find our center, and we need to find our strength and our integrity to approach these times. And that I hope that we can do that as a global community, and to remember the one family that we all are. I hope.
Yeah, aho. And thank you guys so much. We're blown away impressed with how well you put this thing together in terms of the professionalism and stuff, because I oftentimes was we were joking earlier in the pre-pro before we actually pushed record on this thing, that how much it's nice to have people that kind of help collaborate and co-share, like Rack was saying. And I oftentimes feel like a lot of my work is just like throwing a Kleenex into the Grand Canyon. So this did not feel like that. So that's so fabulous. So we really appreciate that. And this is a dynamic where anybody that's on here today, it's like mad respect. This is wonderful. It's nice to make a connection, regardless if this was something that was private or public, or if we were even recording it or not. It's like, I'd want to hear from any of you regardless, just personal one-on-one, because so many of us struggle with, you know, making real connections that we can actually talk to about real shit when we're on this path of internal development, as we know, because for as many people showed up here tonight, there's probably 1,000 other people that seems like they could care less. So they're just fusing into the couch watching sport. But I don't discount that or disrespect that, or, you know, in any way underappreciate people that have taken the time to be part of this. So much love to all, and, you know, inward and upward as always.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And thank you to our incredible community that has been here with us for the past 3 hours. And we encourage everyone to share this event with other people, let other people know about Shamans of the Global Village, and let them know about the Psychedelic Society. We have a lot of events and integration circles, support groups, mushroom cultivation workshops, and more movie screenings to come. And I anticipate more partnerships with Shamans of the Global Village. It's been truly an honor. Thank you to Rack and Niles for your incredible work highlighting, our communities and the indigenous communities. And I look forward to seeing the future episodes and more to come. So thank you.
Aho.
Beautiful.
Aho. Blessings, everyone.
Cheers.
And also leave your email in the chat if you'd like to join our newsletter, and we will stay connected with you. All right.
Awesome.
Have a good night.
Yeah, cheers.